Hi there. The Church of Nowhere and Politics. The ancient Greeks said that politics is life, and you can't get away from politics, and you can't deny that you're somehow above politics, because if it's part of life, then your church, your spiritual organization, if you want to call it that, is going to be part of life and part of the political scene, part of the cultural scene. And it just it's inevitable. So you might as well get your hands a little bit dirty by being political and getting involved in the political life of your community. But don't get too dirty about it and become a sort of medieval church kind of thing about it all, because that really uh, is sort of not on. I say that as if it was obvious, but I actually think it's not obvious because the church, still gets in its hands very dirty in politics. So obviously, it's something a simple point that needs to be repeated quite a bit, really, because people kind of forget and get involved in political shenanigans. But as far as politics is concerned, and this is sort of connected with, the question of whether a church, and the Church of Nowhere in particular, wants to see the world getting better or the world becoming perfect. I would say that the two things are different, aren't they? The world becoming perfect and the world getting better. Perfection is quite a big thing to want, really, because you don't really know what would be perfect. You have this kind of vague idea that, as far as the Church of Nowhere is concerned, veganism would be perfection, and a vegan society would be an example of a perfect society. But as with all philosophies and ways of life, veganism does have its contradictions, its limitations, and its impossibilities. It's not as many as people would like to think, those who actually don't want the world to be vegan because they're making a lot of money out of it not being vegan. But nevertheless, like everything else, there are sort of contradictions and absurdities even that can arise from trying to make the world a perfect vegan place. And that's before you start messing around with culture and telling people their culture is wrong as well, which ends you up in a whole world of pain as regards to people that want to preserve cultures around the world. And if those cultures are based on hunting, for example, then you're not going to make them vegan. You'd have to force people to be vegan, and like Rousseau, forcing people to be free. And the word "force" is sort of fills me with dread. Really, I don't know if it does you, but it fills me with dread. So all you can really do is make things better. And there's lots of campaigns that have been started over the last 40 years to make the life of farm animals better, even though really veganism would make the life of farm animals better because there wouldn't be any farm animals in the first place to improve the lives of. Which some people say would be good, and other people have a kind of funny feeling about that, really, because farm animals are so part of the countryside, and in some places they are part of the ecology of an area. And if you got rid of the farm animals in that particular area, you might do irreparable damage to the ecology of the area. So you see that immediately begins to throw open the question of whether you can just make things better or make things utopian. Because a utopian solution, like the world coming vegan, might mean that you did have losers, and whole ecological systems might be lost as a result of veganism. And veganism and monoculture would be really bad. So I mean, if you're just going to have soya beans grown everywhere, that might be pretty terrible thing. It might have unforeseen consequences, never mind the consequences that might be predicted. So, of course, if you try and make things perfect, you can have unforeseen negative consequences. Whereas if you try just to make things better, then you're sort of working within a certain set of limitations, as it were, practical limitations, and yet you're still doing good for farm animals, just making them have a happier life, let us say. And somebody said that science created factory farming, and so science can jolly well find a solution to factory farming. And although some of those solutions might not be very acceptable ethically either, so you see, it's pretty nuanced and complex. Even though we start off from the basic sort of ethical principle that it's wrong to exploit and torture and kill other sentient beings, as well as to torture and kill each other. That's certainly wrong, and it's certainly wrong to do that to other sentient beings. And then, of course, you have a definition of what is a sentient being. So, as far as politics are concerned, I suppose the Church of Nowhere would support any political initiative that led to an improvement of the life of sentient beings that are used for farming and food production. That would be a given. And where possible, you would educate people away from consuming such vast quantities of animal products, at the very least, and getting them onto eating more vegan food, or more a better sort of quality or quantity of vegan food, let us say, without wanting to force people to be vegan. But there are two forces in this universe, which is really fear and greed. And if you could persuade somebody that veganism was the next thing that was going to make them a millionaire, they'd probably jump at it. Human nature being what it is. So if there's brass to be made out of muck, there's somebody who wants to make a lot of brass. So they could see veganism as being, the next sort of big thing and best thing since sliced bread. And sliced bread makes you a lot of money and has done over the years. So why not vegan food? So that's one thing. And then of course there's fear, which is the other thing, greed and fear. And there could be fear of getting some sort of disease from animal products. Well, of course, we already had the BSE scare and all that, basically, which made a lot of people vegetarian and even vegan who wouldn't have otherwise even considered it. And they're just doing it out of fear of getting BSE, for example, mad cow disease. But that seems to have sort of gone out of the eye of the press. It's probably still around. It's probably still a big problem, actually, especially in the third world countries, but nobody bothers about the third world countries or the developing world countries, do they? So it doesn't matter if they're all getting AIDS and BSE, it doesn't matter at all. As long as the white middle classes of the USA and of Europe are not getting BSE and AIDS, that's all that matters, isn't it, really? Anyway, but I mustn't get too satirical, satirish, because that just leads to anger, doesn't it? And that's no good either. So life is absurd. Life is a tragedy and comedy rolled into one, which is the basis of politics. So I think the Church of Nowhere sort of has to kind of stands between two stools, really. One is engagement, active engagement in politics, and in making social changes and in making changes in the way that we treat animals, for example. And the other is the realization that, that is limited to sort of practical, cultural, and it's limited to, dealing with people's greed on one hand and fear on the other. So it's difficult to be engaged for very long in politics without realizing that fear and greed are the basis of all human endeavour, to do something about fear and to do something about one's greed, one's avarice, one's ambition, one's aspiration. And so that's something to bear in mind as well. So I think, if the Church of Nowhere was going to be political, it would have to be politically wise rather than just political. And it would have to support things that are worth supporting, because they're either going to succeed, they either do have a good chance of succeeding, or because they are hopefully going to transcend fear and greed and make people just behave more ethically for its own sake. So that's another thing. You'd support a campaign which tried to just make people behave more ethically per se, rather than doing it out of fear and greed. So the motivation behind any campaign in the political sphere will be very important to the Church of Nowhere, and Church of Nowhere would encourage people to look at the motivations behind anybody's actions and anybody's emotional reactions, and about anybody's sort of desire to create a utopia on one hand or just make things better on the other. So that's just my own sort of little canvas of thoughts on the subject of the Church of Nowhere and of politics and religion and politics for that matter.